Our NATS values statements espouse and encourage ways for fruitful interaction with each other and all our stakeholders. These statements also provide guidance within the organization for decision-making, along with establishing standards for assessing actions. They describe NAT's leadership and staff commitment to our members. It is important to note that these value statements were created with the expectation that their embodiment will need to be reiterated and reinforced at all levels of NATS and used as a guide for initiatives and actions going forward. We have learned that organizations with strong values are all the better thanks to their enduring reminders in good times and in challenging times. Please join me and all members by being champions of NATS, our new strategic plan, and in our work together with each other. Hi, I'm Karen Brunson, president of NATS. This next session is going to be so interesting. To all of you attendees watching on YouTube, we invite you to use the YouTube chat for your comments and questions. Amy Jarman is monitoring in the background and will send your questions and comments forward to the panel, and they will answer those as they have the opportunity. The ethics of a profession, creating workplace safety. This is a panel discussion, and it will take on conversation about professional standards of conduct and handling things when those lines are crossed by singers, teachers, and
Karen, you're muted. Karen, this is media. You are muted.
Okay, we're going to do this one more time. I'm Karen Brunson, and I'm the president of NATS, and I welcome you to this very interesting presentation. I invite you to put your comments and questions into the chat box, and they are being moderated. The ethics of a profession, creating workplace safety panel discussion will take place right here about a conversation that deals with professional standards of conduct and handling things when those lines are crossed by singers, teachers, or voice professionals. The panel includes an incredible group of people. They include our moderator, who will be Claudia Friedlander. Claudia Friedlander is the author of Complete Vocal Fitness, A Singer's Guide to Physical Training and Anatomy. And she is a fitness expert in New York City. Those in the panel include Zach Finkelstein, a tenor and founder, editor, and lead writer of The Middle Class Artist. Kathleen Kelly, pianist, opera coach, conductor, teacher, and writer, and involved with the finest opera houses in the United States and abroad. And Midgette, music critic of the Washington Post from 2008 to 2019, and prior to that, a regular contributor on music and theater reviews for the New York Times. Nicole Cabell, 2005 BBC Cardiff singer, and now on the faculty at Eastman University. Tonia Sina, founder of Intimacy Directors International, and just did a plenary session earlier in this NATS conference. And Isai Jess Muñoz, associate professor at University of Delaware, vice president of the National Opera Association, where he chairs Sacred in Opera Initiative that explores the interplay between music, drama, and ideologies of world religions. Sit back, take notes, and put your questions in the chat. Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome. I'm so pleased that you could join us today for this panel. We're going to be discussing ethics of a profession. And when we first decided that we were going to do this panel, the original idea was to platform Me Too issues as they play out in our community. But it quickly became clear that the qualities of our culture that leave members of our community, singers, performers alike, more vulnerable to things like harassment also leave us vulnerable to exploitation of different kinds. So we're going to, I'm just thinking that I'm not on the camera. Can you guys see me? I'm just going to check this quickly. Okay. I'm going to continue. I don't see my face on the camera, so if you guys could adjust that and put me in there, then that would be great. But I'll restart this myself. When we first started talking about doing a panel on ethics, we were interested in platforming Me Too issues. And I want to talk to you, as I introduce this panel, a little bit about the qualities that I feel our community has that leaves us a little bit more vulnerable to exploitation, not just harassment, but also discrimination of other kinds. Singing is a real balancing act. It requires us to cultivate both vulnerability and confidence. It requires both courage and the pragmatism to make good decisions about the decisions that we make and where we choose to be vulnerable. It requires both trust and the ability to protect ourselves if that trust is violated. It also requires interdependence because we do these vast productions that are huge collaborations. And it also requires independence because our voice has to come through in those collaborations. We are steeped in tradition. All of these forms of music and styles that go back hundreds of years. And we also must cultivate originality and creativity. Sometimes this gets out of balance, and there can be training programs that emphasize the need to be vulnerable and expose ourselves without necessarily having support for the confidence that we need. Courage is encouraged because we need to be able to step outside our comfort zones all the time, but we also need to know how to create good boundaries and be pragmatic about it so that those boundaries don't get violated. We are required to trust in our teachers. We are required to trust in the authority figures, but when they betray that trust, we need protection and we don't always have it. We are encouraged to be not only interdependent, but sometimes very dependent on the authority figures and teachers who are running things. And so we can sometimes feel that we don't have our independence or agency or have a voice in that. And at times tradition gets emphasized over originality because there is this pressure to get things right and do things correctly that can become such a concern that our individual voices can be lost. And so these are the things that have gone a little bit out of balance that leave us more vulnerable. And I'm just going to run through some of the aspects of our culture that leave us more vulnerable to these things. Not all institutions have these problems, but because it's so pervasive in the culture, I invite all of you to just take a moment to do some, thinking about your institution, where you studied, where you perform. My screen is no longer sharing. Can somebody tell me what's going on?
Yeah, you'll need to share again.
Okay. Okay. So again, there are some aspects of our culture that are very pervasive that we're so accustomed to that we might not realize that they're contributing to some of these things that make us more vulnerable to exploitation. The first thing that I want to touch on is structural scarcity. When you apply to school, you will show up and find out that there are limited performance opportunities, limited financial aid, limited access to prominent teachers and coaches. So everyone who is accepted into these programs is expecting to have access to certain things, but not everybody is going to be able to enjoy the same degree of access to all of these things. Has my screen stopped sharing again?
Yes, you'll have to share again.
Is that a problem on my end?
No, I think
Okay.
we figured out what's going on behind the scenes.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So we accept students into our educational programs, and we make them all the same promise that we're going to provide them the same quality of preparation, but we have these scarce resources that not everyone will get to be able to partake of equally. Once you become a professional singer, there are limited audition slots. So not only are roles difficult and rare to come by, but even getting in front of somebody so that you can be considered, that's limited. And limited information. What's the next step? What am I ready for? What does it take to pursue a career? Sometimes this information can be very difficult to come by as well. Our institutions often have inadequately defined standards. There's a lack of clear performance standards required to earn a degree. What are you supposed to be able to do by the time you finish your bachelor's or your master's? Well, when I go to school, I'm thinking, okay, they've promised me that by the time I finish my master's degree, I'm going to be professionally viable. But these standards are never codified. There's also a lack of assessment criteria to evaluate how well curriculum meets student needs. Our curricula sometimes are not as well set up to help the singers as the instrumentalists in a program. There's little evaluative criteria to assess student progress towards goals. And then once you're out in the professional world, we don't have clear professional casting standards to ensure fair hiring practices. So if you don't get the job, they've got the cover of just saying that, well, there's no accounting for taste, but there's no way to tell whether it was this, to the best of their ability objective, I want this person because I think they're the best for the job, or whether it's being influenced by opinions or some discriminatory thing that no one would know about. In school and in the profession, there is inadequate accountability often. There's little to no oversight of studio teachers. Once that door is closed, we don't know what's happening behind that door. There's little to no studio teacher accountability for student progress, and it's often assumed that if some students get the result and others don't, it's because the students who did not succeed didn't apply themselves or didn't have the talent. There's little to no oversight of conductors and coaches. So again, once that door is closed, we don't know what's taking place behind it. And therefore, there's poor protection for singers who end up being harassed or discriminated against by authority figures. In the professional world, we've seen this play out that our union, our performers union, AGMA, has been very good at defending the rights of those who are accused of harassment and not so good at protecting the victims who come forward. We have inadequate transparency. We just accept that in this culture, there are going to be these teachers whose methods are shrouded in mystery and secrecy, and we just accept that's part of the process. There's also secrecy surrounding casting practices and policies, but mostly we have this persistent myth of talent and a persistent myth of luck. So we can just assume that if a singer doesn't get the result, it isn't necessarily because they were ill-served by their institution or their teachers. It just wasn't meant to be, because only those few people who have this amazing combination of talent, luck, and hard work are going to get there. We don't know when we start these programs whether or not we're going to get the result by the time we leave. We have problematic financial practices. Schools have to fill quotas to meet their budgets, but then the institutions are failing to deliver on their promise to provide every student with the same quality of education and the results that they expect when they enroll. The resources are prohibitively expensive for many people except the most privileged. We have predatory student loan companies. Students are just encouraged to take out as much money as they need to pay their tuition. And they figure that, oh, well, the school accepted me, and so I must have what it takes to make it. This is going to be a great investment. And then find out that they finish their program not ready to go to work and burdened by heavy loans. We have predatory competitions who charge upwards of $150 for application fees. We have training programs that charge large amounts of tuition, but then you show up and you find out that you've been quadruple cast and you don't get any coaching. We have poorly managed producing organizations and training programs that start out with the best of intentions, but then never really get their business molded together. And then you get hired to do a production with one of these organizations and they don't have the support or they aren't able to follow through. We have professional companies charging audition fees, passing on their cost of doing business to their prospective employees so that they can rent the space to be able to hold the audition and so on. And we have managers who charge high retainers. The culture is also beset by a quest for validation. We have this emphasis on doing things correctly over fostering individual expression. And when you want to get something right, the person who decides whether it's right or not is the one in power. The scarcity of resources fosters favoritism. If I'm the one handing out the goodies and I get to pick who gets them, that gives me more power than I ought to have. The scarcity of opportunities fosters objectification. Oh, well, if all of these singers are the same, I'm going to take the one who seems to, get along with me the best, or who looks the best, or is the most like something that I think it's supposed to be, rather than really trying hard to reward the talent. And the scarcity of opportunities leads to a sense of invisibility or interchangeability, which is really demeaning for singers. And then they feel like they have less agents and they have to curry favor by looking more like this or that thing that is going to get them the validation they want. We have an institutional leadership vacuum. We've seen institutions prioritize their own liability over worker and student safety. This is something that really came to the forefront with the Me Too movement, that our institutions were reflexively protecting the harassers in some cases, or just so surprised to find out that this was happening on their watch, because what we really need is for our institutions to do some soul searching and house cleaning and say, yes, we contributed to this problem, we're going to be part of the solution, but they don't want to get sued. And so we don't hear them say that nearly as often as we need to. They have a demonstrated lack of motivation to change because they're more concerned about preserving the status quo. They have an instinct to side with authority figures and celebrities. And there is, again, little effective institutional oversight, as AGMA does not have a lot of power right now in their current structure to be able to have oversight over institutions to make sure that they are providing equitable arrangements for their employees. And NASM as an accrediting body, it has very marginal effectiveness where these issues are concerned. My very first musical that I saw on Broadway was A Chorus Line. And if you take a moment to think about that, it encapsulates in some ways and romanticizes some of the problems that we're looking for now. Singers are easy to take advantage of and mislead because we love what we do so deeply. And it's even instilled in us that we're supposed to be doing it for love, not for compensation. And we're supposed to be making these sacrifices. And if we suffer, it's all because we love it so much and we're so lucky. But this leaves us vulnerable to not only discrimination and harassment, but also low pay, poor working conditions, and long hours. To really enjoy workplace safety and performance in pedagogy, we need freedom from discrimination and harassment. We need equality versus we need to pay attention to what's going to make things equitable rather than just looking to try to even out the scales, because what attempts we've seen often try to do that, but it doesn't work out. And my colleagues here are going to talk to you more about why that is. We need advocacy and we need transparency. If we can work together, we can bring balance to our culture. People will feel safe being vulnerable because they will be confident that they will have the protections that they need. We will be able to trust in our institutions to have our back because there will be recourse when we need things, when we need protections, when our trust is violated. We will enjoy this balance of interdependence and independence, and we will be able to respect traditions and also feel that there is a vehicle for us to pour our own voices into. So I would like to now turn the discussion over to our our group that's going to be talking about Me Too issues from a variety of different perspectives. So if our moderator could please turn this over to Anne and Kelly and Tonia.
Hi.
Everybody.
Well, thank you, Claudia. That was an amazing, sweeping encapsulation of many of the problems of our industry. I would add that meeting at this time that we are meeting, my hope is that this shutdown is affording us time and space and necessity to redo a lot of the systems that we've got and hopefully help to get it right. The silver lining of COVID is that we are going to have to redo things anyway. So let's eliminate a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. I think you summed it up beautifully. We wanted to chat a little bit about how we come to this story, and then talk among ourselves, which I think is a better way to sort of present the ideas that we have. But I came to Me Too, it became sort of a pinnacle of my career, and it was a story that in my 11 years at the Washington Post, I never set out to write. I wasn't really aware of. Somebody came to me and said, you ought to write about Me Too around the time of the Levine allegations coming out in 2017. And I said, oh, I'm a critic. I do feature stories, but I can't do this kind of investigative work. And this person said to me, no, people will talk to you. I will get people to talk to you. So I sort of reluctantly said, well, if people will talk to me, I'll listen, and maybe I can find a writer who can do justice to this story. Many people contacted me. I heard many stories. My eyes were opened, personally, professionally. It was really like the story of a lifetime. I talked to, it was 50-some victims and an additional 20-some people who knew victims of various forms of sexual harassment. I enlisted the help of a colleague because I didn't have the experience, even after 20 years in journalism, to write this kind of investigative story where it has to go through lawyers and the entire newspaper is involved in weighing in on it. But it was a story that came from the field. It was a really collaborative effort. And it opened my eyes to the magnitude of the problem. We agreed that the purpose of this panel is to talk about best practices moving forward rather than to dwell on where we've been. And all I can offer to this panel is views of what I've seen of where we've been that I know that we need to do differently in the future. So that's my take on it. And I've met many people here through my work on that story as well. For instance, Kathy.
I just want to say thank you for the chance to be included on this panel. I admire the work of everybody who's here, and I'm just very pleased to be in this company. I spent most of my career working for opera houses, and then began working in academic institutions. And I also. And when you were beginning to work on your article, that was a time when a lot of things were coalescing for me in terms of some of the big stories coming out of the opera world. But I found myself really at an intersection. On the one hand, like with most people, I think it's easy to see the ways in which discriminatory practices have affected you negatively. It's harder to see the ones that advantage you. And having moved from the opera house to the academy with students relying on me, as people began to talk to you and other people who were doing this kind of writing, I really came up against hard my own equivocating in my own profession. I think expertise is real, and I think the respect that we have and the way that we honor the carriers of our oral tradition is really important. And I understand very much the wish to preserve that. And I see the ways in which I have been part of a system that has acted only partially to help people who are at a disadvantage in it, in the name of preserving people whose talent I admire, or people who have helped me. I mean, I think that's very hard to talk about, and it's an important part of what we are beginning to talk about and what we need to keep talking about. It's hard because it's admitting that kind of accountability is uncomfortable and difficult. I do see very much how the reverence that we have for many of our important figures, and frankly, for the dollars that they command from our patrons, how that has compromised and held back our also in many ways sincere efforts, both in performing institutions and in the academy, to move towards practices of restitution, practices of equity, and I also hope, along with you, Anne, that this is an opportunity where we will be forced as a group to act with more acuity and more energy, building and rebuilding going forward. So those are my words. Tonia, you are a person whose work I have been admiring and who I've finally gotten to see in action in the last couple of productions that I've been involved in. So, hi.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Tonia Sina. I come from the theater world, and I essentially am responsible for coining the phrase intimacy direction in my master's thesis in the early 2000s. Back then, it was a specialty that did not exist at all. I wrote about it as a fight director who was seeing these scenes of heightened emotional content and sexuality on stage not being properly choreographed the way other forms of choreography were handled. And so I took it upon myself to create a technique that as soon as I began to research, realized that this was a big gaping hole in the industry. This is long before, any Me Too stories came out in the theater. So I had been already collecting stories and stories and stories at workshops I was teaching, and my own experiences as an abuse survivor, but also as, a member of the theater community and just the performing arts community, which we like to say, if you have been part of the theater or performing arts or even music or any sort of arts, you have seen things that are abusive or harassment. You have enabled that behavior, probably because the system was made to enable that behavior. And in some cases, you may have actually been an offender. And most of us have been all three in some situations of varying degrees. And because of that, it's very difficult for all of us to go back in time and say, okay, I did that 10 years ago, and back then that wasn't considered inappropriate, but now it is. How do we go back and reassemble this? We're going to take it all apart, and there's going to be the big can of worms. Now there's worms everywhere. So, as we like to say, those worms are nasty to deal with, and they don't disappear very easily, and it's a big mess. But that's the only way to fix this. The only way to move forward is to deal with our past and what we've done to each other in the past, and the voices in the room that have not been considered, and the demographics of every room that we're in, and what that means. I'm also a member of the disabled community, and as that, in itself, a lot of my perspective comes from being disabled. And as an artist that is disabled, originally not being able to tell anyone I was disabled because it would have cost me some jobs. Now that's beginning to change, but the rooms where we work are not always accessible, and pretty inaccessible actually to a lot of people. So that's also part of this. And I use that to explain to people why listening to other people's boundaries is something that is something we're not used to, and something that we need to start developing. A way to be able to create a safe space that everyone feels confident to be able to say they have a boundary that we've tripped upon, and have the right to change whatever's going on in order to feel like you are safe at work. And everyone deserves to feel safe at work, emotionally and physically. So those are the protocols that my colleagues and I have developed for the performing arts. It started in theater, and then it trickled into film, and now film has pretty much taken over. And recently in the last couple of years, we've also tiptoed into opera, and opera is different than theater in some ways. And, you know, rehearsals are different in the way it works and the way things are tangibly done in the world of opera is not quite the same. However, the culture of abuse is very much in there and something that needs to be discussed and talked about, and also racial issues that just kind of overlap with all of it. As of right now, the intimacy direction community is, it looks very white in the movement, and that's something that we're all really working on expanding from the original group that kind of brought this forward, and trying to make sure that all the different nuances of sexual harassment are part of this, not just sexual harassment to one group of people, but to everybody that experiences it in different ways. And it's also not based off of gender. We're realizing, you know, originally when I first started researching this, it was very much women are being abused more than men in the industry. What can we do about that? And realizing that actually the abuse is really, it sweeps over everybody, and it's not based on gender, and it's not men abusing women, it's everyone abusing everybody. And so all of that to say that we have our protocols that we use in the theater now, and we are constantly adapting them to other fields to help navigate tangibly what to do. We know that there are contractual and there's, you know, a way to report harassment, and that's a totally different thing. Ours is, what do we tangibly do in the rehearsal hall to prevent harassment and abuse? Not to be retroactively talking about it after the fact, but before. It should be preventative rather than reactionary. At least that's the goal, I think, that we're all trying to do. And the only way to do that is to take everything apart and put it back together again, which is what we're doing right now, and it is not easy.
I think it's wonderful that one of the things that emerges right off the bat from the three of us talking is that to segregate Me Too as an independent thing is a mistake. And I know that after I wrote the Me Too story, many Black people, people of color came to me and said, when are you going to do the race one? And I did want to do the race one. And the paper was a little bit like, we can't take on another huge story. We're all drained from this one. But they're not separate. This is all an issue of power. And as Claudia intimated in her introduction, we're all a piece of this power. Somebody said something to me when I was working on the Me Too story that have stuck with me forever. She said to me, people who have power don't think they have it. That's the root of Me Too. And I thought, oh my God, that is actually the essence of it. So many people are inflicting. Some of the worst offenders are the people you've never heard of at small universities who have like a lock on the entire department, and nobody can advance without that person being on your side or doing something for you. And so they can torpedo an entire career very easily, but yet that person feels totally ineffective because they're in some small city and nobody at the New York Times even cares enough to investigate the abuses they've done. And I heard stories from young women who reported abuse by the proper channels, and the proper channels did the proper things and said, okay, you may no longer have any contact with that professor except by email. Well, great. But if that professor is casting everything or putting together all the concerts or also happens to run the local orchestra, then you, as a woman who can't have contact with him, are actually cut off from all of the networking and all of the opportunities you otherwise have. But I think a lot of people listening to this are working individually with students. I mean, there are people on all levels, I realize, but the real issue is the power that comes up in a voice lesson. As Claudia said, the idea that you have the power to give somebody a goodie, it enables you to have favoritism because you get to cast this role. And I think that plays out a lot in voice studios of people who are incredibly well-meaning and don't mean to do it. But we all have seen favoritism in voice studios. We've all seen favoritism in rehearsals. We've all seen well-meaning teachers trying to advise young people how they should be in ways that are incredibly well-meaning, but maybe totally culturally insensitive and inappropriate. without even realizing it. That's the way that systemic racism happens. And once those boundaries are violated, yes, it can become a horrible Me Too story, but it's happening on a very small level all over the place. And I think as teachers, it becomes one's responsibility to really look at boundaries, as Kathy said, to look at our own accountability and think of how to model a more just, equitable system of teaching that doesn't get too invested in pushing somebody's career, or doesn't get too invested in hanging on to your students who have made it. I mean, voice studios can get very cliquey, and trying to get beyond the clickiness to really be teaching and being sensitive to the different kinds of personalities and styles, and not just trying to turn out cookie cutters of the right way, is essential. And it's essential to the continuation of this field as art. It's not just about best practices, because art is living and art is varied. And we are at risk of being a cookie cutter art, partly because of the ways that we're taught. And this contributes directly to the problems that we're here to talk about in this panel.
Yeah. Well, when we're a good 100 years, I think, into classical music, taking a road away from popular music and other forms of composition, right? So that makes preservation of the past even more important. And so that connection to looking backward and trying to be authentic and trying to hang on to that, that spills over into conversations about how people look and how people dress and how people act, and the important performers and creators that they have access to in a way that is not very 21st century and is not very helpful. But it's also very hard to see, you know, what you said, Anne, about, and Claudia and Tonia, about this being structural. It's, I think there's such a wide cultural conversation now, even outside of our business, about identifying your own part in a big system. And I think that you can be somebody who is not malevolent, who is not trying to hurt someone, and who might be walking up to somebody to give them advice on their dress length or their Spanx or their hair or their ornaments or whatever, out of the best intentions to like help them get ahead. But what those conversations are doing are just tamping down tamping down a big immovable system, and figuring out big accountability and small accountability, and that is our challenge, I think.
If I may jump in, I remember getting in a debate with an educator who we were talking about a young woman who was going to become a music critic. And this educator badly wanted to sit her down and lecture her on how she had to present herself. And I said, well, I think she's doing fine and she's got a great job. And the educator tried to tell me, no, he was a man. He tried to tell me, no, I understand, because I teach young people how she has to present herself. And I thought, I am actually in a discussion with a man who has never done my job that I have done for 20 years about how a woman needs to be in order to succeed at my job. And I think that's unquestioned. Like almost everybody at the table was on his side saying, well, yes, this is what you have to do. And it's like, no, honestly, I'm the one doing it. I can tell you. And I won that argument because the young woman in question did completely fine. And I was able to prevent the sit down talk that she was supposed to get. So, but I think that happens a lot, and it's perfectly well-meaning, as you say.
Sure.
Yes, I think that there is a lot of people that have good intentions, but good intentions don't make you totally immune to being an offender. We always say it's impact. The impact is what's important versus intent. You may intend to never say anything racist, and then a racist thing will come out of your mouth, and then you say, no, I didn't mean that. Well, it doesn't matter what you meant. The impact is that what you said was racist. Same thing with every other thing. So it's really making sure that we are educating people properly, making sure that especially tenured faculty is still going with ongoing education about how things have changed. You know, things have changed a lot in the last couple of years. And if you're not constantly learning still, you're going to be behind on this. I can say that, you know, it makes me feel, especially even learning from people younger than I am. I have a lot of younger mentors who help teach me, you know, about the correct way to say things and the things that are outdated that even, you know, in my generation that I'm getting wrong. That, you know, we have to be diligent on making sure that everyone's voice is being heard. And the only way to do that is because they haven't been in the room in the past. So now they're here. So now we got to listen.
Tonia, you make me want to jump in and say just your phrase, younger mentors, is a real turnaround of our paradigm, right? If we even more than other professions are married to the backward look, the way things used to be, and all the people that can connect us to that, it can be very hard to accept that the most experienced people in the room and the people with the biggest stature are not necessarily the people with the answers in this case, and just the idea, I feel like that's a revolutionary thing that you just said all by itself. Younger mentors,
everyone should have one.
I'd like to, at
feel
this
upset
point,
of the paradigm, right? I mean, to talk about greater equity in all of our structures, including structures of expertise. It doesn't negate expertise, but it widens the definition of what that is in a way that is like really exciting, and hopefully is something that those of us who love expertise can like get on board with and run with and love in a really like engaged and curious way, like students.
Yes.
So we're moving into a discussion of how different people from different backgrounds have different lived experiences. And I think it's important to consider singers and mentors of different generations having that too. I certainly rely on my younger peers right now to help explain to me what is going on in the world, because if you were born into this, you have a very different perspective than those of us who have been living with this. So I think this is a good moment to turn this over to our panelists who are going to be talking about diversity, and we will hear a lot more from Anne and Kathy and Tonia later. Okay. Jess, would you like to?
Sure. Can you all see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to take a moment here to just share my screen with all of you, because we're going to share a PowerPoint presentation today on diversity. All right. So here we go. Thank you so much, ladies, for setting this conversation up so well. For those of you who are joining us this evening and whom I haven't had the pleasure to meet, my name is Isai Jess Muñoz. I serve as Associate Professor of Voice and Opera at the University of Delaware, and also as Vice President of the National Opera Association, a sibling of NATS, whose commitment to diversity initiatives have been long-standing. And I'm also pleased to serve on the NATS National Committee on Advocacy, which was charged by NATS current president, Karen Brunson, to help lead NATS in several different directions, particularly in recognizing that diversity within our resources here at NATS and collective thinking only makes us stronger. This portion of our plenary session, which will now focus on diversity and what it means to be an ally in relation to workplace safety, was co-prepared with my colleague and friend, soprano Nicole Cabell, who has recently been appointed on the faculty of the Eastman School of Music. And as most of us are aware, Miss Cabell is a BBC Cardiff Singer of the World, whose career has taken her to the greatest of stages and concert halls. Now, Nicole was currently moving cross country en route to Rochester as we speak, and consequently she's unable to join us live, but we are most grateful for her contributions to the preparation of this session. And towards the end of this portion of our session, we'll have the opportunity to hear a few pre-recorded thoughts from her. I also want to take a moment to thank the University of Delaware Office of Equity and Inclusion, who provided us with a wealth of resources for this portion of our presentation today. Now, when it comes to diversity in relation to workplace safety, we know that in most of our institutions and places of work, we have non-discrimination policies in place. But we want to keep in mind that organizations and institutions are the people and not the legal documents. So in order to have equitable distribution of resources, we need more than just the written policies. We need allies who can support, empower, and stand for equity for all its citizens, which includes those who are in the minority. Now, with the hope of offering our listeners some steps and guidelines for how to seek out workplace safety and equity for all members of their communities, we wanted to quickly provide some ideas on diversity, social justice, and cultural plurality. We also wanted to offer some thoughts on what it is that an ally does, and finally to provide some insight on how we can become stronger allies and advocates within our institutions and the field of singing at large. In order to see successful allying and advocating happening within those spheres of influence, we're going to want to consider a few things. First, we want to understand the meaning of diversity in this context. The definition you see on your screen is taken from the NATS Diversity Inclusion Toolkit that was published earlier this year. When we talk about diversity, we are talking about all forms of human difference. Diversity can refer to people of various races, genders, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, religions, ethnicity, and mental or physical abilities. When applied to NATS, defining diversity should also include diversity of ideas and cultural diversity. Now, when talking about being an ally or advocate in relation to diversity, we also need to understand that we are talking, in fact, about social justice. Because as allies for diversity, we should be working to regard cultural plurality. A new term for some of us, perhaps. Cultural plurality means that minority groups participate fully in their societies while also maintaining and celebrating their cultural differences. In communities where cultural plurality exists, we can see the presence of groups with differences, not simply commingling, but thriving. And we see these societies greatly benefiting from the full participation of these minority groups. Now, in the context of social justice, in this context, what we're talking about social justice, what social justice means is that it is a vision for our society where there is justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within the society. And there are three pieces to social justice that, when seeking to attain a continuum of cultural plurality, we should live out in our communities. And the first of these pieces is equitable distribution of resources. Now, keep in mind that resources are not just finances. Resources can be a host of things, which can include knowledge and also access. We also want to keep in mind that equity does not mean the same thing as equality. I'll repeat again, equity does not mean the same thing as equality. Equality is about sameness, which involves giving everyone the same thing. But equity is about fairness, which is about making sure that people have access to the same opportunities. Because of our differences and varied trajectories, we don't all need the same opportunities. We don't all need the same things to be successful. We need different things. Take, for example, a third-generation college student whose parents and grandparents attended college. because that student probably has several people at home who can mentor them through the highs and through the lows of the college experience, they may not need the same things that a first-generation college student may need in order to be successful. In this case, an institution looking at living out a practice of equitable distribution may want to create programs that can help their first-generation incoming students have the resources that they need to gain fair access. This idea of practicing equitable distribution of resources could easily apply to other members of the community, such as junior faculty members of diversity. When resources are being equitably, not just equally distributed, we begin to see the second piece of social justice emerge. And that is that we foster a self-determining and interdependent society, where whatever an individual person works diligently towards, they are able to achieve, because the barriers have now been taken away, right? When social justice with an eye on cultural plurality is successfully lived out, we also begin to see the third piece of social justice emerge, where communities consist of individuals who understand their communities and their responsibility to others and society. This third piece of social justice is so very important because it involves everyone in the community. This not only means that people in minority groups better understand their identity and place, but it also means that those in the majority become aware of their own privilege and can then respond accordingly in leveraging their position to help someone else. So the goal, when looking at diversity through the lens of social justice and cultural pluralism, is to provide an opportunity for everyone to have fair access to those things that will help them to be successful, that everyone can find the shoe that works best for them. So as we contextualize this goal and we reflect on it, we need to be thinking about what it could mean to be an ally for diversity in our schools of music or places of business. And so I quickly want to give some language to that then we can use. So first, what does an ally look like? An ally is a person, and I'm going to minimize this screen. I don't know if you all can see it. Here we go. An ally is a person who supports, empowers, or stands up for another person or a group of people. An ally is a verb, not a noun. It can become a very active process. An ally interrupts or intervenes to stop the mistreatment of others from continuing. Now, when we talk about influencing people and having an impact towards the leveraging of differences, we want to understand that there are 4 spheres of influence where allies can work. The first sphere is self, which involves shifting our paradigm and ascribing to new ways of how we view other people. It will be difficult to change the world around us if we don't first take time to reflect on what are our own values and beliefs of people who are different than us. The second sphere is close family and friends. The third sphere is social and working environments and relationships. And finally, the fourth sphere is community. Now, we also want to understand what an ally can look like when they are acting in a passive versus a more active way. And it's important to say that this is to not trivialize efforts or make anyone feel as though they are not doing enough, but rather to help us self-assess and understand how we can best support the call to equity within ourselves and in our own communities. And I'll just say that most of us with a heart for cultural plurality begin as passive allies first, who in time then begin to see ourselves developing into more active allies. So it's fine to begin on the passive end of allying, but always with an eye on successful outcomes. So for the sake of time, I'm going to focus this evening on only 2 spheres of influence. The first, self, and then social and working relationships, because I think they are the ones that most apply to this session's focus. So first, the sphere of self, where we reflect on our own values and work to internally shift our paradigm. And as a passive ally, when I'm focused on self, I may feel compelled to donate money to a diversity initiative. If you're a passive ally, you may empathize with what you see and wish to educate yourself more. You may even engage in what we call soft public forms of display, wearing a safety pin perhaps on Black Heritage Month or this, our Pride Month. Now, when you are an active ally and you're focused on self, you're going to go beyond watching a webinar on diversity or advocacy, and you're going to take time to more seriously reflect on your own disposition and biases towards other people, and not just periodically, but in continuum. You will perhaps step out of your home to attend a town hall or organizational meeting, rallies, marches, diversity events, you name it, and you will post public post, or you may feel very comfortable posting publicly, like on social media, making people aware of where you stand. Now let's visit the social and working relationship sphere, right? When we are at our institutions. The passive ally here will perhaps commit to attend a workshop, maybe even use some of their scholarly creative funds or professional development funds for the bettering of themselves through learning. And they may even go as far as to connect one-on-one with a colleague or student who is different from them, just to truly get to know that person, and knowing that in doing so, they may feel more comfortable around you. But the active ally, post-attending that conference, post-attending those webinars, they will take time to share with their colleagues and supervisors what it is that they learned, suggesting resources to their boss and director, taking it beyond just engaging the people around them. If you are an active ally in your social setting, you're going to support and give voice to those marginalized identities by organizing, planning, administering meetups, programming curriculum, giving all minorities a platform and tool to empower themselves. And when necessary, you will directly and professionally, that's really important to know, intervene, calling those things that are wrong. And so I wanted to take a moment to just provide some examples of action items for an active ally who may be working in a department, conservatory, or college of music, where an active ally is actively participating by organizing, administering, and leading ventures such as diversity-focused recruitment initiatives, addressing things like financial assistance, continually working to facilitate recruitment opportunities that are culturally responsive. Also, diversity-focused student retention groups, services and activities providing diversity scholars across to mentoring and advising that is specific to their needs. We see recruiting and retaining faculty and guest artists in the diversity pool. Listen, students of diversity will be hard pressed to commit to your institution if they don't see themselves represented in your faculty. And creating a diversity council within your own department of music, this could be seminal. This could be unbelievably powerful, that you're not just having a presence of social science dialogue happening at the university at large, but that you bring it home by having a diversity council in your own department that can serve as your welcome and hospitality team to incoming students. And they will normally consist of people who are the ones willing to put in the extra work that it sometimes takes to get a student of diversity acclimated and accepted in your community, so that the communal growth we long to see can begin to happen. Of course, minority research opportunities and thematic concerts. And among the action items should also be curricular considerations. Repertoire is one of the things that we move into quickly. We think about that, but what about those staged productions? Research, collaborating with the college's Office of Diversity and Equity, Afro Studies, Women's Studies, Disability Studies, to learn how to respectfully create and delineate characters that might differ from who they are, so that our productions and projects don't appear anachronistic, right, or even offensive to people. We need to be sensitive to these realities. And here's just, you see an image there of LA Opera, some of the wonderful initiatives they have. They're a fine example of people who are regarding casting people of color, disability, ageism, size, and of course the building of diverse audiences. LA Opera here with their Hispanics for LA Opera initiative. Of course, addressing marketing standards and intimacy director. We heard from intimacy directing. We heard from Tonia Sina earlier today, and intimacy directing that can be adapted to diverse cultures, right? We may not all have students who feel comfortable kissing on stage simply because of where their cultural stance is. So back to this goal. We are allying and advocating in order to provide an opportunity for everyone to have fair access to those things that will help them to be successful, right? That everyone can find the shoe that best works for them. But more than that, that through our efforts and our willingness to change, we create opportunities where our citizens in the minority feel that they belong, not just welcomed. I'm gonna move here. I have this image here that really resonated with me when I thought about this, about belonging. That they feel valued, that they feel welcomed, that they feel that sense of belonging, that makes it clear to them that you are supposed to be here. It's this sense of belonging to a community that brings us ultimately to workplace safety, where everyone can have a seat at the table. A table where we can eat food with flavors that we recognize, where we can openly tell stories in our own tongue and dialect, where the mask can come down because we feel safe at the table. But our working spaces will never be able to foster that kind of sense of belonging that ushers in safety if we don't first take time to interrogate ourselves. So active allying and advocacy for that sense of belonging may absolutely require us to acknowledge some truths that have surfaced, and then in light of that truth, to begin operating differently. So I just want to say that I'm so honored to have been invited to present on this topic today. And I hope that these ideas can help all of us craft responses in the area of diversity. And at this time, I wish to leave you with some thoughts from my dear colleague and friend, Professor and all-star soprano, Nicole Cabell. And so I'm going to take a moment here to just share her video with all of you now. Here we go.
Good evening, everyone. You've now heard from Dr. Muñoz on a topic that is so close to our hearts. Here are just a few closing suggestions that may help all of us along the way as we ally and advocate, as we educate dominant group members in understanding the different contexts, as we work to create institutional and cultural change, and as we support disadvantaged group members by encouraging, listening, and providing resources. With all this in mind, let us acknowledge that in many instances, we artists inherited fields that lack connection, recognize that our discomfort does not give us the right to exclude other people from living in our spaces, lean into courage rather than discomfort, realize that those best suited to answer difficult questions may not be those people currently in the room with us, present humbly, listen in a way that would require us to change, commit to sharing power over giving permission,
Pursue equity over upholding our own traditions. Understand that belonging requires a give and take. Understand that openness is not for the faint of heart. Work with our offices of diversity and inclusion and our centers for study of diversity. Our scholars in the field of social science are there to support and to help us examine our teaching models and sometimes non-inclusive approaches to inclusivity. They are there to help us create that sense of belonging that we long to see, helping us attend to power dynamics in discussion and create safe and brave spaces so that we can vulnerably share our musical stories. It may take more time to analyze and understand the ways in which various identities relate to each other, but it is this kind of work that can lead to more informed responses in seeking solutions. Thank you for listening.
So I just join Nicole in thanking you for tuning into this portion of tonight's session. And I'd like to now pass on the reins to our moderator once again, Dr. Claudia Friedlander. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Jess. And thank you, Nicole, if you're out there listening. So many wonderful things to think about and so many strategies that are available to us to move our whole culture forward. Thank you so much. I'd like to turn this over now to Zach Finkelstein, who is going to crunch some numbers for us and talk about the way that financial equity can be a really great thing for our industry. And I'll just turn it right over to you now.
Hey, y'all.
The screen is sharing.
Thanks for coming out to the seminar. Is my screen up? Everyone can see it? Great. My name is Zach Finkelstein, and I'm a professional concert tenor. I've been hustling out there for about a decade now as a soloist with symphonies and opera companies, as well as with pro-choral groups like Conspirare. In my dual career, I've also worked in marketing communications, public affairs, and brand strategy for 8 years as a senior research manager. I also run a site called middleclassartist.com, where I've spent the last year researching and addressing the challenges in our industry, particularly as they relate to young artists. I'm here to talk about the ethical challenges in the classical music business from a bit of a different angle. One part writer, one part artist, and one part data analyst. Today, I'm going to focus primarily on the economic challenges to artists out in the field, building on the research I've done at Middle Class Artist, as well as academic pieces, industry market research, and artist testimonials. I'd like to start from first principles to determine what an ethical action is in the music business, and what is an unethical one. I'll use this framework to examine systemic challenges for young artists today, including a culture of fear and intimidation, paying artists last, the living wage crisis of young artist programs, contracts and force majeure, and I'll finish with some data on the systemic racism in our industry by way of economic exclusion for BIPOC artists. Let's talk first principles. Without going too deep into moral philosophy, I'd like to outline two ethical guidelines, something old and something new, and show how they might help us determine the right course of action when it comes to young artists. The first principle is the preferential protection for the poor and vulnerable. From the Old Testament to Catholic social justice to health nonprofits like Partners in Health, this idea comes up in many different contexts. Simply put, quote, the obligation to provide justice for all means that the poor have the single most urgent economic claim on the conscience of the nation. For our purposes, it means that every decision we make, from the repertoire we choose to the fees we charge to our hiring decisions in operas and orchestras, must take into account the protection of the vulnerable as a primary goal, not as part of a subcommittee or ad hoc idea, but a core part of our artistic mission. The second principle to test our industry ethics is one of economic participation. This modern principle says we all have the right to participate in the workforce. Quote, employers must respect the fundamental rights of artists, which include the right to productive work, to a living wage, and economic initiative. With these two principles in mind as our ethics test, let's take a look at a few of the systemic challenges in classical music. The first systemic challenge is our culture. From top to bottom in the classical performing arts, there is a culture of fear and intimidation. This culture goes straight to the top. It is an extraordinarily powerful force. In 9 years of performing as a soloist, I have never seen someone talk back to a director or conductor in a rehearsal or question an artistic decision made by management. We see this culture in the historical exclusion of Black voices from leading roles and the inability of those artists to speak out. In a 1997 LA Times article about systemic racism for Black men in opera, the paper quoted baritone Simon Estes as saying, "I've sung 97 major roles in major opera houses all over the world. Why is it that I'm not good enough to sing in my own country?" Estes broke his silence despite his manager's warning to be quiet lest he ruin his career. "My managers told me years ago not to talk about it, but there's a problem, a sociological problem. I know many other African-American men who are more than qualified who are not allowed to sing leading roles. People in positions to hire and fire, whether they're doing it consciously or subconsciously, are denying African-American men a chance to share their art with their people." End quote. In March of this year, Middle Class Artists published an article examining this culture of fear and intimidation at the Met over the past decade and the sacrifices artists have made to keep the house afloat. One Met soloist who requested anonymity out of fear of retaliation opened up about his experience. This is a direct quote from the article. "One Met soloist accepted an offer in the late spring for a 2014-2015 season role. Over the summer, his agent came back to him with a different offer, 10% less than the Met's first promise. The Met cited financial struggle as the reason for the reduced fee. The singer's agent told him at the time, 'It's the Met.' The singer agreed to the second offer. In his words, 'Of course, it's the freaking Met. I'm not going to say no to anything.' So even singers who have made it to the top of our industry still fear its gatekeepers." A second challenge is the contract we are required to sign, specifically the standards in our industry of paying artists last. When the you-know-what hits the fan, we're the first to be laid off, and even in times of economic boom, we're the last and least to be paid. Because of the way our pay is structured and the execution of the force majeure clause, artists bear nearly all the financial risk of classical music production. Imagine a tech contract in Silicon Valley that asks programmers with a decade of experience to work for free until the product launches, and if it doesn't launch, they don't get paid. Well, that's how artist contracts work for singing in North America. Our contracts are 0% down, 100% upon performance. It's pay to play. If you can't sing, you don't get paid. Established classical artists are required to pay for all our business expenses up front, including hundreds of dollars in coachings and materials. We spend thousands of dollars up front in travel and room and board, only reimbursed upon completion of the contract. Those reimbursements are not paid back sometimes until months after our contract is signed, forcing us to pay hundreds in credit card late fees until we're made whole. Companies do not pay artists for rehearsals. That means an artist who pays to learn the role, who pays for their travel, who rehearses for a month, and who is unable to sing the performance due to sickness may lose thousands of dollars and months of time on a paid contract. The icing on the cake is our force majeure clause. It says in the case of a 1 in a million disaster, like say an epidemic of COVID-19, that makes a performance inadvisable, quote, or impossible, everyone's free to walk away without obligation. In a viral article posted on March 2nd, middle-class artists predicted the dangers of this clause and the risk imbalance towards artists, particularly high-risk, high-reward musicians like opera stars. A leading opera star makes a lot of money on an opera contract. Still, they may only be able to fit in 5 or 6 a year, and the bulk of their business expenses, travel and hotels, coachings, and multiple apartments are paid up front. What happens when you lose 2 5-figure contracts in a row like many did this spring? Even if life went back to normal in the summer, that could be $100K wiped out with thousands to pay up front in expenses and taxes. Even the most influential stars in the world would have a hard time coming back from that yearly loss, let alone middle-class artists like myself. My peak time for performing is Easter and Christmas. This spring and early summer, I lost 11 performance contracts. A few companies postponed. The rest were optimistic, but with no commitment. Only one of my 11 contracts had paid me in full. Thank you, Craig Johnson and the team at Conspirari. Why do we sign these contracts that give away our economic rights, and why don't we speak up more when there's a legal argument to push back? For example, several of my canceled contracts didn't have a force majeure argument that mentioned an epidemic, and other contracts were in states that had not yet locked down live performances. The show at the time could go on. The answer is simple: a culture of fear and intimidation and an imbalance of power between artists and gatekeepers. The third challenge is the barrier of entry for young artists that excludes the poorest and most vulnerable. The critical barrier that prevents artists from participating is the structure of American young artist programs. A recent study by Lindbergh and Pitts published on Middle Class Artists reviewed 55 young artist programs in America. they found that 3 out of 4 young artist programs with budgets less than $250K when adjusted for cost of living do not pay a living wage, and only 1/3 of all apprentice programs paid a living wage. Another study middle-class artists published in January showed that across a cross-section of 50 top festivals and training programs, companies paid artists an average wage of $12 an hour. The companies charged an average of $32 to apply, not to audition, to apply to these festivals. This is not a guarantee to be heard and does not include the cost of travel or pre-screening videos. We also showed in a regression analysis that there was no relationship at all between revenue and application fees. Some small companies charge no application fees, some massive companies charge about the average, and most of them are clustered around the $32 regardless of size. We concluded that there was a default market rate for applications and that most will charge artists the market rate. To sing leading roles at A houses, we require an opera singer to attend multiple summers in this apprentice economy without any income, to spend time and money applying to dozens of programs for years. What do these 3 challenges, the culture of fear and intimidation, the pay artists' last contracts, and the young artist program barriers all have in common? They all fail the moral imperative to protect the poor and vulnerable first. When powerful companies ask, quote-unquote, artists for favors or pay cuts to sign contracts, when they refuse to reimburse their expenses and pay them for rehearsals, citing force majeure, and when they pay their young artists on net nothing, they put themselves and their patrons ahead of those who have the single most urgent claim to economic justice. All 3 challenges also fail the economic participation test. When artists are excluded from the right to participate in the workforce, when they are paid last and forced to pay expenses first, and when they are offered a non-negotiable wage that does not cover their living expenses, they are prevented from participating in the arts economy. And most importantly, by not addressing these 2 principles, we fail in our commitment to diversity and our lack of action to address systemic racism. How can classical music credibly represent POC and minority artists who are less likely to come from privilege? How can opera companies credibly claim to represent diversity when the barriers to entry, years of unpaid or pay-to-sing opportunities only available to the most privileged, are so steep? It is BIPOC artists who are the most vulnerable to a culture of fear and intimidation. It is BIPOC artists who are most vulnerable to the risks presented in our contracts. And it is BIPOC artists who are left behind when we force our young professionals to work for years in unpaid opportunities to even have a chance at a main stage role. What can Nats and teaching artists do to address these challenges? We can call out fear and intimidation publicly when we see it in our colleagues and act as allies in the fight, not silent protectors of privilege. We can reduce our fees to artists after they graduate. We could do this by providing a sliding scale of fees, a pay-what-you-can approach to teaching. We know that many teachers are severely affected by this epidemic, but by the moral principle of protecting the poor and most vulnerable, we also know that artists, particularly BIPOC ones, are worse affected, and we should put their needs above our own. We can eliminate application fees. I know some people in the audience participate as teachers or administrators in pay-to-sing and young artist programs. Coming out publicly against practices that exclude BIPOC artists, such as charging $30 to send in a video, would be an excellent first step. We can redesign curriculum to highlight prominent BIPOC composers and musicians, bringing non-white, non-European voices into the conversation. And we can put people in positions of leadership, particularly related to casting, who are most likely to understand and experience these challenges firsthand. A wealth of research has shown that BIPOC persons are significantly underrepresented among licensed music teachers and tenured faculty, as well as the staff, conductors, and boards of major orchestras. Artists have the moral right to productive work, to decent and fair wages, and to economic participation. Key structural elements of the classical music business are contracts, barriers of entry such as application fees for auditions and requirements of years of unpaid labor, inhibit access for all artists to participate, and disproportionately affect BIPOC ones. The more we talk about it publicly, the more likely we can affect change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach. All right, that has been just a wonderful and exhaustive coverage of taking inventory of many aspects of our profession where we have the opportunity to create some change. If there's an upside to the pandemic right now, it is this, that we've hit the pause button on everything that was happening in our industry. It's going to be very difficult for us to adjust once things open up again. But while we have this pause, a friend pointed out to me, it's much easier to fix an engine that's been turned off, that is no longer turning. So our engine has been turned off, and now we get to decide how we want to upgrade it. And with that, I would like to just open up the discussion. If my fellow panelists, if you'd like to talk to each other about anything that's come up, and we'll also be scanning the comments on the YouTube feed for any questions that you might have, those of you who are paying attention now.
Well, I found so much of this so eye-opening in many ways. I'm really grateful to be part of this panel, and I feel like I'm processing so much helpful information that I wish had been out there for years. But it's wonderful that this moment, a combination of the COVID shutdown and the ongoing renewed awareness of the Black Lives Matter movement, are leading us to this kind of conclusion and this kind of forum. I mean, this is, I hope, speaking truth to power. I hope that large institutions will be taking note of these kinds of practices. Of course, large institutions go back to the traditional, well, artists have never been very protected. But the idea that art has a moral imperative to do better by its proponents, by its protagonists, is a really enlightening and invigorating one. And I hope that people will take that as an impetus to try doing better in many, many areas. I would throw out there too that since our mandate has been to put out best practices moving forward, what would you say, any of you? I mean, Tonia, you've worked very specifically on a set of best practices that can improve the rehearsal sphere. You know, I would love to hear more about that, and I would love to hear more about what Jess and what Zach think that companies can concretely, you know, what are 5 steps that a company coming out of COVID could do to prove goodwill and show a change of heart moving forward? The big ones might not listen, but the small ones might.
Sure, I'll go first. I don't have, I mean, it would take a while to kind of go through some of the, all of the rules that we came up with, but for the most part, you know, I've been doing this for about 15 years now, and it took a really long time to get people to believe that this was necessary. So the majority of my career was spent begging people to listen, and as we say, sort of shouting into the void. So now that the momentum is picked up and the Me Too movement actually crashed into the intimacy direction movement and pushed it forward. And so those two waves kind of collided, and it was a matter of being at the right place at the right time with a solution that had been peer reviewed and researched, that it wasn't, oh, we have to do something about this. Does anybody have any ideas? It was, well, we've been fixing this for quite some time. So this has been proven to work. And so that was essentially the Me Too movement pushing this forward. There's still a lot of work to go. And I think one of what we have discovered in the creating of protocols for any rehearsal hall is that you have to leave it as a living document. You cannot say concretely, this is the way things are now going to be and they will never change, because people change. Everything's changing. The language we use in rehearsal halls change, and we all have to evolve with that. So there can't be an ego around fixing the problem and wanting to have your name on the solution. And in fact, what we have found that when that does happen, it just backfires on anybody that does try. That ego isn't part of this, but community is. And I think that's being humble is going to help guide us forward, because the people that do have the power to change things are sometimes the very people that need to move out of the way and allow more voices to be heard and to come forward. And as we say, you know, we want to amplify those voices. We don't want to speak for them, because I cannot speak from certain perspectives. I can only speak from mine. And so no matter how, you know, well-meaning the protocols are, they have to keep changing and they have to keep evolving based off of whoever's in the room and how you want to work. But our 5 pillars, they are essentially our foundational document. And it's, you know, we start with context for the story and make sure there's a context and a reason behind having any of this material on stage. It has to be artistically sound. It can't just be, well, I want to see this woman in this outfit because of her breasts and how beautiful they are. That's not an artistic reason to make that choice. So everything has to have, you know, sort of an artistic backing to it. And then consent, we all must be consenting to our jobs as we go, making sure it's enthusiastic and not coerced. Then there's communication. We all must be communicating and be freedom to say your boundaries and to respect other people's boundaries. Choreography, we need to make sure that all of the moments that we have on stage are choreographed and planned and set so that they don't change suddenly in the middle of a performance. And then closure, which at the end is just to mark the ending of whatever it is that you're working on, and tells us the difference between the scene and people and actors versus their characters, and that those are separate things. So those are the 5 C's that we use, and have found that they really do translate into other specialties in really, really strong ways. So my hope is that continues to evolve, and that as I, being one of the founders of this movement, must be able to then also step aside and allow newer artists to take the foundation of what we created and to apply it to all the different dynamics that come in when you have all these different perspectives that I can't do myself. So that's what essentially the movement is shifting now from, you know, from the people who started it to all the other voices that are going to adapt it and spin off into all these other topics to make sure that that everyone is being heard in the way that they need to be heard, and not just the way that we think everyone needs to be heard.
I just wanted to share, can everyone hear me? I just wanted to share that I just really applaud Tonia for all of the fabulous and incredible work that she is doing. Because it's this idea that she mentioned early on in the presentation where she stated that their job is to prevent something from happening, right? Again, we know that those non-discriminatory policies are in place at our institutions, the Title IX and the harassment policies that are in place. But again, that organizations are not the policies, they are the people. And so in that context, I guess the big thing that I wanted to leave everyone with is that equity does not mean the same thing as equality. And equality equals sameness, but equity equals fairness. And so when I was talking about that student who might be a first-generation student versus the third-generation student coming to college, right? Or the junior faculty member who was the first person in his family to get a college degree, I'll just personalize it and I'll speak candidly here. That was me. And I didn't have anyone in my immediate family who had attained even a bachelor's, an associate, yes, but a bachelor's in music. And so looking back at my undergraduate experience, and I'm very proud of where I went, but I didn't have those resources that maybe I needed that other people that other people didn't need, just, you know, had access to. And so, so it took me a while to get caught up in that way. And so this idea that faculty members and leaders may have to put the extra work in that they need in order to be able to see then diversity reflected more vividly inside of their institutions. This is crucial, this is important. And sadly, along the way, I've heard several faculty members who maybe they tried to make the effort earlier on, but for whatever reason, something happened along the way, right? There was a missed step, and they got discouraged in having to move through the red tape and seeing that the dreams that they had weren't coming to fruition. So I think part of that is that it does take a village. You need your leaders to be behind it, and don't give up. That's what I want to leave my colleagues out there with. And I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, I've even heard some people calling it the new civil rights era, that it's not just a drop in the bucket, but that it really provides an opportunity for us to be able to see some serious change. So if you're out there and you've received an email from your president at your university or from your provost inviting you to just send them an email and tell them that you support whatever it is, or that you want to be part of a task force, if you've been discouraged along the way, now's the time for you to get up. Now's the time for you to say, yes, I want to be involved, and help make a difference and make inroads in this.
Thank you, Jess. We had a question come in on YouTube that I want to address. Someone was asking about adjunct wages. And because we have an audience here that is largely voice teachers and singers who are possibly aiming at a teaching career, I think this is an important thing for us to talk about. There are a lot of adjunct jobs out there that are part-time, or if they're full-time, it's a heavy workload, but it doesn't quite pay a living wage. There are also adjunct positions out there, entire voice departments whose faculty are on an adjunct basis, but who are well compensated and do get benefits and all those other things. So it can run the gamut. But in my experience, what will often happen is a voice department realizes that they need more teachers. And so they cobble together a budget and they get it through, and then they feel like they can afford to hire an adjunct to just take on a few students. But they're not really thinking about what that adjunct's experience may be, or at least not to the extent that I wish that they would. Because when you're starting out your teaching career, you can find yourself juggling 2, 3, 4 adjunct positions at different universities. And the paperwork burden and the organizational burden for each one is like the same that would go with a full-time job. And so you're just juggling all these positions and still not quite scraping by, and nobody's providing you with benefits. But we entered the profession with the idea that, like, oh, we're going to have to pay some dues, because if I could just hang in there long enough, then I will be able to meet the qualifications required for this other school that wants to hire, you know, a tenure track teacher who has 3 or 4 years of experience in academia. So this is just going to be the way it's going to be for the next 3 or 4 years. But those 3 or 4 years can turn into your entire career. And when that happens, it's not just that it's tough on the adjunct teacher. If you belong to a faculty where you have some full-time, full professors, assistant professors, full-time adjuncts, and part-time adjuncts, what you have is a lack of equity, because not all of the teachers are being served equally by the institution, but then our students are also not being equally served, because if your teacher is a full professor who has office hours and you can go and see them all the time, and they can come to all of your rehearsals and they can come to all of your concerts, you're getting one level of support. But if you're studying with the adjunct teacher who can only be there because they've got studio space for 4 hours a week and then has another job that conflicts with the concerts that are happening on campus, you are not getting the same level of support for your education from that teacher that you would if you were working with somebody who had a different arrangement with the college. And so you have this community of voice teachers who ideally should be supporting each other and feeding off each other's energy the way that we are on this panel right now, but they all have varying levels of power, which means that they're going to have a different level of ability to go to bat for their student if the student is not being served, if they are not having successful auditions or getting a role. You're not going to be around and have the ability to go to bat for your student if you need to be an ally for that student or advocate for them in some way. And so when there's an imbalance like that, that's very difficult. And one of the other things is that if I'm an adjunct teacher and I'm barely scraping by and I love my students and I want to give them everything that I have, but my own life is unsustainable, I'm not going to feel like I'm a very good role model for that student, because they're supposed to want to be like me. And I want to be able to tell them that, like, if you work hard and you reach for the career of your dreams, you are going to be able to create a wonderful life for yourself in singing or in teaching. And while I'm still scrambling and not feeling like I have what it is that I need for myself, it's very difficult for me to communicate that kind of optimism to them. Shout out to Michelle Marquardt-Deveau, whose pre-conference workshop I attended. Michelle works with voice teachers to help them improve their business. And she gave a great workshop the other day. And somebody asked her about whether it was worthwhile adjuncting. And she just said something along the lines of, you're never going to make as much money as an adjunct teacher, or possibly even as a tenure track teacher, as you will if you're the one who's in control of your own business. And so I just want to put all this out there for all of us to be thinking about the way that we want our voice departments to look like going forward, because your institutions are going to want to be attracting the best, the brightest, the most creative talent to be your faculty members. And I would like to see all of our institutions be able to offer a good living wage to all of our teachers. And some teachers are going to want to be independent, but for those teachers who really want to be part of an academic community, it would be great if there could be a place for them where they can have their career and have their life and be good colleagues to their fellow faculty members and be good role models for their students. So,
Claudia, if I can speak into it just quickly, and I know Kathleen is also full-time at Cincinnati as well. So Kathleen, feel free to join me in chiming in here. This is such a fully loaded a question or just area to discuss. And it is one that is so relevant right now, particularly because of COVID-19 and because universities are seeing an enrollment cliff. We already were projecting an enrollment cliff in the next 5 to 7 years simply because of birth rates around the world, particularly in the performing arts. And now with COVID, we're seeing an even deeper enrollment cliff where we're projecting that what sane parent is going to advise their child to major in music, right? And so because of that, we have all of these losses happening at universities. You see universities coming back saying, I have a $40 million loss just from the spring alone, 50, 60. Next year, it's going to come up to $120 million. So we're seeing that full-time lines are being eliminated. They will be replaced possibly with adjunct lines. We're seeing that universities are also already furloughing their adjuncts. And this is happening all around the nation and around the world. So at this time, I think that it's an opportunity where full-time faculty need to be sensitive to the adjunct arrangement, and they need to advocate for their adjuncts. Of course, adjuncts are going to be in fear at this time, not quite sure of what the future may hold, and because of that fear, unable to speak up. So this is where they need an advocate. They need an advocate speaking on behalf of them and looking at the curriculum, looking at inventive ways of how to be able to make that curriculum a little bit more malleable so that we can also look at saving or restoring some of our jobs.
Thank you, Jess. I'm seeing so many wonderful. Oh, Kathleen?
Unmute yourself, Kathleen.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to say, in addition to Jess's beautiful, beautiful advocacy for people participating and stepping forward and taking on the mantle of self-education, but also involvement in their institutions in all of these questions, to also draw into that Zach's beautiful use of the phrase moral imperative. When we bring all of these things together and talk about actually achieving equity for all of us, that is something that can sustain our art and our practice for real. But we have to get involved in taking care of each other. And I think in our current system, which across the board, not just in the arts, has got deep, deep divisions of inequity on so many levels, and we've touched on those in so many levels. To speak about actually going for equity is to speak about very revolutionary things. And so I guess those are some words that I wanted to say. Inspired by this incredibly beautiful and truth-telling, but beautiful advocacy that I have been just so pleased to listen to tonight from my fellow panelists. Thanks.
I could talk to all of you all day about this, but we're unfortunately going to have to wrap up not too long from now. And so what I would like to ask each of our panelists is if there is a key takeaway and or a call to action that you would like to leave our audience with. I would invite you to, see if you can sum that up. Who'd like to go first?
I would say it took me years to realize that I could be part of any difference. As a female critic in a male-dominated world, I was so focused on learning to run with the white men and prove myself that it was really not until relatively recently that I thought I can use this platform for more than that. And I wish I'd seen it earlier, but anybody who is dealing with readers, audience, young people, we all have some power. And what Kathy said about really look at how far you have collaborated, how far you have been silent when you could have spoken up. We all used to play that game. What would you have done in the Third Reich if you saw the Nazis? Would you have, dared to take a stand? We're in a moment like that now. I'm not saying we're surrounded by Nazis, that's a different discussion, but I'm saying that we all have the power to do something to make it a better world and a better system and a better opera world or singer world for everybody. And so the call to action is for all of us to look and see what things we can do concretely to help move this forward.
I'll weigh in. I have sort of separate takeaways and call to actions. The takeaway that wasn't in my presentation is that we are living in a digital opera world for potentially a very long time. And I've started to notice the offers I've been getting are, 10 cents on the dollar, what I used to get, or sometimes for free. So I think both artists and presenters have to be vigilant not to let decades of artist and worker rights slide in a time when, so-and-so institutions in need, we should cut them a break. And we should work together with institutions, but we should also come from a position of both of us are working on this together. And I just think we should be very careful in this time not to give away all the rights we fought for as artists. And that kind of ties into a call to action, which is, we all have a platform, some big, some small. Especially now on social media, some artists have a huge platform, arguably bigger than some institutions. And it's our responsibility to use it to speak out as a call against inequity and injustice. And for those who have been scared to speak out, and I've known a lot of artists who've come to me privately with issues, I would say you would be shocked at how many allies you have in presenters and academic institutions who want the same thing. We all want to get through this together. We all want to build a better world. Some systemic elements are preventing that from happening right now, but I think you will be pleasantly surprised if you speak out on certain things. Maybe a few institutions won't hire you, but a shocking number of allies across every aspect of our industry are with us. So I would say, don't be afraid. We can do this together. I
have a call to action. My call to action is for my fellow olds, all of you with hair my color, whether or not you're wearing that on the top or not. I've been so moved over the last couple of weeks watching so many different groups of people come together to do these virtual discussions, which, Zach, you're right, we're doing all over Zoom now. I wish I would have invented Zoom. That would have been amazing. But what I notice is that so much work and so much sharing, and I mean, so much burden is being like taken on willingly by people who are so much younger than me. There are so many Black artists and young Black artists, young artists of color, younger people who are stepping forward to speak, to say things out loud that they have not said out loud before, and I encourage all of you fellow olds. The people who should be working harder are the older people, the people with more standing and the people with more protection, the people who have tenure, the people who have got big positions with big compensation. That's where more of the effort should be coming from, more of the effort for self-education and more of the risk-taking. So that's the call to action that I would like to issue to my industry.
I'll go. So I think that there's so many takeaways, but I think if I could narrow it down and sort of distill it, I would go to, it seems like a really big task to change the way things are. And that may feel really daunting. Just like, this is a big, heavy wheel. It takes a long time to turn. But I've seen personally how one person and one idea is all it really takes to start change. And that you don't have to look at the entire system and be like, how am I going to fix this whole big thing? But that you, one person, and the things that you choose to do, and how can you in your life and the way that you work and choose to be, how can you change small things about the way that you are to affect change around you? And that will just ripple out. And one idea can change an entire industry. It does take a community to change, but the idea can come from one person. And so don't feel that you can't change these things because you're one person. It's totally possible, and find your team. That's the best way to move forward. Find like-minded people who you want on your team, who you work well together, and then all of a sudden your one voice is totally amplified into a team, and then eventually you'll realize there's an army behind you. And I think that that's how we move forward. You know, just use your privilege to help the other people that don't have the privileges that you have. And everyone listening to this right now has privileges that other people don't have. If you have access to this, you have some privileges. So that means that there are other people that we need to be reaching that are not on this call, that we need to be getting this message out to them. And that's my sort of call to action, is act. And one person can make change happen.
These are all such beautiful thoughts, what everybody shared. I'm getting emotional just hearing it. And partly because this might be the end of all of us just talking about this together. We spent the last couple of weeks just planning this and being able to meet and hearing those collective voices. It was just amazing. I guess my final call would be, for those who are teaching out there in institutions, or even if you're teaching just privately in the private studio, the one thing that I would encourage you all to do, if you don't know how to begin or where to get started, is to go ahead and reach out to an office of diversity and inclusion, or diversity and equity. Certainly those of us who are in major research institutions, our universities have these offices. Some smaller colleges may not, but surely you're near or in close proximity to a larger institution that may have. And what I have found along the way is that these larger institutions, they're excited to share their information with colleagues in smaller institutions or even private teachers. They are there for everyone. They're there for the citizens. So, so I would just encourage you to reach out to them and find some language, find some tutorials that then you're able to then incorporate inside of your classroom. Totally, what Tonia said is dead on. It can start with one person, but in institutions, we do live out often, or we hope to live out parliamentary order, right? So I also think about shared governance, and then that you consider as you're ready, emotionally ready, to then take what you learned from those resources and then begin to share it with some of your other colleagues. I know it can be difficult to share this information inside of your department. So also what Tonia said, find your team. Maybe your team players are in the Department of Engineering, right? Or in the Latin American and Iberian Studies program. Hey, interdisciplinary collaboration, folks. It's here, it's alive, it's well. Get moving in it, get dancing in it. And the last thing is, this is about celebrating. I think that often, and particularly Black Lives Matter, there can be a tendency for us to focus on it just in this dark light and negative light. And what I want the outcome to be is that we are celebrating our differences, that we can live out cultural plurality, where we're inviting people to just take it all in. And so find those people, those team players you can celebrate with. Thank you.
So what I'd like to leave you all with is just to point out that we weren't so thrilled with the status quo before the pandemic. So now that things have shut down, take this opportunity to envision the way you want things to be. For all of those people who have told you, oh no, that's the way we've always done things, and that's the way we will continue to do things. Well, we can't go back to doing things the way that we used to. As Kathy pointed out, yes, there are things that we are lovingly conserving. There are traditions. There is this vast repertoire that we adore. And so let's not think that the attitude that we have to have about embracing those traditions is at odds with creating new traditions, more inclusivity, a new way of doing things. So think what it is that you want to see in your own life, in your educational institutions, in producing organizations, and make the assumption that there's an opening here, there's an opportunity here. And the main call to action that I have for all of you is let's keep the conversation going. This is all just a jumping off point. I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to talk to all of you and hear your points of view. We consider us resources. I know that I'm going to want to draw on the expertise of my fellow panelists for resources going forward. We are all here for you. And this is just the beginning of a conversation that has the potential to steer all of us in a better, more equitable direction. So, are we at time? I'm so happy to be here with all of you now.